Hello and welcome to Creative Walks. This is Pedro Bonatto, and today I want to talk to you about this kind of interesting project that I did. It's an exercise that I did during my master's about, 8 years ago now already. Time flies, but very cool. If you listen to the podcast already, you probably heard the episode where I ranted about the uselessness of doing a Master of Fine Arts, so at least in my case, it certainly was a struggle and not in a good way. But there is one thing I will never complain, which is my master's, by the time I was in my life and where I was, it brought two great things that unlocked a lot of things for me. The first one was that experimental class that I mentioned, that you're supposed to go into different areas that are related to your main field. And that's where I discovered studio photography, which was one of my main interests. And I got into some installation art, which is something that I know that this year I will get into. So just giving yourself the opportunity to just go and explore and try new things and try different art forms and try to incorporate into your own practice, be like a Renaissance person. That was invaluable, although it was not the objective of the class itself. So I can never ever recommend doing a master degree, at least not in the context in which I made. But there is a second thing that happened in my master's that I will always be grateful for, which is the exercise of making a self-portrait. And when they were talking about making a self-portrait, it's sort of like not necessarily going and painting yourself or the equivalent today of taking a selfie. It's an artistic representation of yourself, a self-portrait, but it can be done in any kind of medium, in any kind of form. It could be a portrait, a self-portrait as a artwork, as a performance piece, as a design element, as an actual photograph. And that seems to be a very simple exercise, or very, let's say, indulgent exercise, but I think it's a very, very powerful thing to do. And I think if you take it not literally, how would you represent yourself in a different, let's say, art form or art style that maybe you are not considering to do, it will unlock all sorts of interesting things. So I highly recommend doing that exercise. The way I did it, and I think that could be an actual exercise on itself, independent of how you decide to do a self-portrait. But it was an interesting insight I had when I did this exercise. The way that I decided to do, and back then it was like the first year of my master's, and I was more into going into design rather than photography or art in itself. I was into maps, and I was very into the idea of using maps and visualizations to express interesting, different ideas. And I was interested in maps also from the point of view of the relationship between science and art. So what I ended up doing, and it was a very, very cool and fun exercise, was to see my life as a city map. And what I decided to do with that project was to imagine that downtown was my childhood, because it's the oldest part. It's the one that brings all the memories. It's the one that establishes everything. So I put downtown in the middle of the page, and that was my childhood. And each building was an element that was important to me when I was a kid. In my case, it was comic books, and it was a couple of cartoons. It was skateboarding. It was that warehouse where the bully of the school was. Then it starts branching out, so the city starts growing, and that's the next stage of your life, and it grows all around. And what I thought it would be interesting to do was that the roads would be named after the people or the ideas that started inspiring you. And then in my case, it was first books that I read that were very important, and how they opened up, let's say they literally opened up these roads in this map, which were the self-portrait of my life seen as a city map. And those were like sometimes quotes. So I would have, for example, when I was about 12 or 13, so it's a little bit further ahead, the city's already like a little bit more going to the outskirts. I had Albert Camus that was presented by my dad, and Jean-Paul Sartre, like those guys, and how they were like important to me, and how like there was like a little building that I created, which was about my interest in martial arts. I was doing judo, for example, and my parents didn't want me to do karate because I was like kicking, and they were very worried about me getting hurt. So I couldn't do that when I was a kid, and I really, really wanted. So that was like a forbidden building. Like I could not go to the karate building, so I put that in the map. And then as you can get the idea, like you start growing your city. And then when I went to college, I was thinking to do between advertising, architecture, or business administration. That's how far I've gone. But I started one, so you have these buildings that are unfinished. And then you had, for example, that when I discovered Carl Sagan, and that created a highway to interests in science, which led to my physics education, which was a disaster, but lasted a couple of years. It's not for me at all. I started doing this, expanding this map, and it was a very interesting exercise to do. The other thing that I decided to do, right, more or less a joke, but it certainly is a important element on anyone's life, is how do you represent your friends in a map, or how do you represent the important relationships you have, and how do you represent your beloved ones, like your romantic encounters that you had throughout the years. So the way that I decided to represent that specifically was to create these, like in cities you have little rivers, little ponds, that go eventually into the ocean. Over time, depending on how impactful that love affair was, I would put those rivers on that little corner of the city block, and those were like named after the people that I got involved with, or that at least that I had some romantic interest. That ended up expanding, and then I put some elements, like some things that just came to mind when I was doing it. Sometimes a building burns down. It was, for example, I had a nanny, which I called my third grandmother. She used to take care of my mother, and then she used to take care of me. She even took care, and my sisters, and she even took care of my nephew until he was about 3 or 4 years old. So it's certainly an important person in our family. And when she died, I was about 21. And I remember that I decided to paint that building and then burn it down. And it was, I just wrote there, Leo died. It was a map for myself. So I created this self-portrait as a city map. And that was kind of a cool way to explore it. Some people did literally as a portrait, some people did it as performance, some people did it as music in the project, in the university class that I was in, like as in the master's. But to me, this was very cool. And then one thing that I've done ever since, not in that artwork itself, but in something that I created for myself in a journal afterwards, was like to do this expansion of my little city and play around with what different kinds of buildings, different kinds of, like there is this forest, or then at some point I had very important change in terms of my love life back 6 years ago. And I remember when I drew it, continued my map, it was represented as a storm, for example. Then today I see it as more like finding the ocean. So it's like, oh, the city actually grew to the sea, right? It grew to the shore. So I thought that was kind of a cool idea that came over time as I was working in this ever-growing self-portrait. But anyway, I think it could be an interesting exercise for you as an artist, if I could recommend it, to come up with an idea to do a self-portrait. It could even be in writing, could be poetry, could be anything. But I am biased to the map. I think it's a very fun and interesting way of seeing yourself, like how you come back sometimes downtown, you come back to your early childhood, sometimes you come back to this time in your university. And the ideas being these roads that these quotes or these influencers, let's say, of your mind, these intellectuals that bring you to different avenues of exploration. So I would recommend you trying to do that. I am on my way to the gym, getting my lazy ass there, because it's been already a few days since I've been there, and I need to start getting progress on. So let me know if you do this exercise of the self-portrait, either if you do it as your city block, as your city, or a city map, or if you do it as whatever other thing you do. Let me know how it goes. Like, I would love to see it. I'd love to see what you guys come up with and how you come up with. Hit me up at Pedro Bonatto with 2 T's on social media or on my website, pedrobonatto.com, which is possibly one place where you found this. So with that, I'll see you tomorrow.